Hey, welcome in Huddle. I'm your host, JR, presented and brought to you by FanDuel. And we have a special Bracketology episode to get to here with the Big Ten looking very interesting. We've got a number of bubble teams, a number of teams fighting for top seeded spots. And as always, we have my guy, Jason Carmello, here with us. He runs Big Underdog over there, his website where he does Bracketology, does great work. And we've had him on the past, I think, couple years at this point, right, Jason?
That's right. Yep. Last couple years.
Awesome. And Jason always does such a great job. And he does a great job with his website as well. Jason, before we get started, do let people know where they can find your website and all of your content at.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, JR. You can find me at big-underdog.com and also on X at Big Underdog Blog.
There you go. All right, let's waste no time getting straight into this, Jason. The Michigan Wolverines are the top team in the Big Ten, and I'll go ahead and pull up their resume and everything here next to us. So if you're following along with us here live on YouTube, not live, we're not live this time, but if you're here with us on YouTube, you can see kind of the resume and some of the stuff that Jason might reference when it comes to them. Jason, this Michigan team has been excellent all year long. They're the number one team in the country. There's already talks out there about them wanting to go to Philadelphia if they do indeed get the number one seed in all of the tournament and everything else. It looks like this Michigan team is going to take it, but they don't have the easiest road to end the season. Duke is coming up, Illinois, at Iowa, Michigan State. Is there anything that could happen here at the end of the season that would risk Michigan losing this number one seed?
Yeah, good question, JR. I think in a doomsday scenario, right? If they lost the Duke, Illinois, Iowa, and Michigan State game, which they possibly could, I guess in a doomsday scenario, yes. But I think the reality is Michigan's the best team in the country. I think they've been the best team in the country really the entirety of the season. Other than a slip up in the second half and that kind of stunning home loss to Wisconsin, they've been impressive. I mean, we're talking about a team that had beat Gonzaga by 40 on a neutral court early in November. And since then, they've won at Mackey Arena, which is incredibly tough. They beat Nebraska, Michigan State, and such. They're going to be a one seed. Them and Duke, getting ready to square off in DC will be a fantastic game on Saturday. They're equipped to go on the road because of the best defense in the country. That allows them to win big road games, and we saw that at Purdue and Michigan State. And they have the fourth best offense in the country. Really, really good. 13-0 on road and neutral games, and all of the metrics, whether the predictive metrics looking forward or the resultant-based metrics, have them as the best team in the country. I think they're safe. Could they slide around a little bit? Yes, but we're talking about they would be measured against other one seeds. And for example, UConn just lost at home to Creighton to get kind of slide out of that last one. Michigan's safe. If they win just a couple of those games, they'll be in fine shape for the one seed.
And the overall one seed, that Duke game is probably the most important one for that one, because obviously if Duke gets that
Yep.
would put them right over them for that number one overall seed, as they are number one and number two in net right now.
Yeah, that's completely correct, right? It's a 2-game swing either way. It's based on where they want to play. I think they came out today that Michigan wants to go. They want to take kind of the Philadelphia route, right? They want to kind of go through Philadelphia. They want to avoid Buffalo and the cold weather there. So, listen, I get it. Ultimately, in the end, the number one overall doesn't mean a whole lot. Having a one seed does. The number one overall is more of a bragging point, but the reality is it doesn't really matter with who you're going to match up with in the second and third round.
Yes, agreed. All right, let's move on to one of the teams that they'll be facing, the Illinois Fighting Illini. I'm very excited about this game. Illinois has one of, if not the best, offenses in the country. They've set records with Ken Palm and their offensive ratings. I think they had the best first half, or maybe it was half of basketball. I don't even think it was limited to first half, but half of basketball against USC. Now USC, an injured team, but it just shows how good this Illinois team, especially with everybody back, everybody healthy at this point. They're very highly regarded. They have 5 losses on the season, but people are still talking about the Illinois Fighting Illini as a team that could still possibly get up there to maybe being a 1 seed. I see them projected as a 2 or a 3 seed the most right now. Tell me, is it possible for Illinois to get up to being a 1 seed?
I don't think so. Listen, they're fantastic. Best offense in the country. I think they're probably going to max out at the front of the 2 line. There's just a lot of traffic that they have to jump ahead, and they've already have 5 losses. Now, the closing stretch, for the most part, isn't all that difficult. UCLA hasn't been playing very well, but it is a road game, and the Bruins will be desperate. The home game against Michigan can absolutely move the needle, but the reality is they're not going to climb ahead of Michigan. They're not going to climb with 5 losses ahead of Arizona, and they're not going to climb ahead of Duke. So everybody is scouring for that last 1 seed. I think as of now, Houston is ahead of them, Iowa State is ahead of them, and UConn is ahead of them. And while a home win over Michigan would allow them to move forward somewhat, I just don't think they can get to the last one. I think they have a very real shot, and if the committee met today, they'd be a 2 seed. I think it really shot at a 2 seed, potentially the 5 or 6 overall on the 2 line, but I think they'll max out there. Listen, those road wins against Purdue, Nebraska, and Iowa are fantastic, but that, just the same as Michigan, that home loss to Wisconsin hurts a little bit as well. Defensively, they're not quite as strong as some of those other top teams on the 1 line. Just too much traffic, 2 seed.
Yeah, and I think the media selection committee, they got together today and we're kind of doing some stuff. I don't know how much they're actually going to be taking into account or anything, but they did have Illinois as a 7 ranked team, which would put them right there on the 2 seed line. So we'll see what Illinois can do. But the most important thing, I think, right now for the Fighting Illini is to not move off that 2 seed line. Would you agree?
Yeah, I agree. I think, listen, the statistical metrics of advancement in the NCAA tournament increase exponentially once you get inside that top 4, number next to your top 4 seed line. 5-12 games have become, in essence, a 60-40 game, right? They're a little over a coin flip. 6-11 games are literally a coin flip. They're almost 50-50. So it's really critical to get a top 4 seed. That gives you over an 85% chance of making the second round of the tournament, right? So that's the key. Can you get into that top line? I think they will. And again, I think 2 seeds in the right spot for them.
All right, very good. And another team that's going to be vying for a top seed in the tournament are the Purdue Boilermakers. Bit of a shaky situation here for Purdue. They had that 3-game stretch at UCLA, Illinois, at Indiana, where people are kind of questioning them a little bit more. Had the ability to maybe come back to a bounce back against Michigan. Unfortunately, they get blown out a little bit at home. They did make it look a little bit more respectable, 91-80 there later on in the game. So I'm sure that'll help them metrics wise and everything like that. But, Jason, what are your thoughts on Purdue and how high of a seed it looks like Purdue could get? Maybe if they win, 5 straight here to end the season, Indiana, Michigan State, at Ohio State. That's not the worst road game in the world in the Big Ten. At Northwestern and Wisconsin, you have 3 pretty tough games there, but all at home, and 2 road games, 1 in Ohio State. That is a quad 1 victory if you get that there on the road. How high could Purdue get themselves if they go undefeated here to end the season?
Jared, the Boilermakers to me are, I'm going to go football reference for you, right? I'm going to go pro football reference for you though. But, I over the last handful of years, the Chiefs have been so dominant. You felt like during the regular season up until this year, the Chiefs almost went through the motions, right? They knew that they were playing for the playoffs and they knew what they had and they knew they were experiencing all those things. That's kind of Purdue. They've all been around, whether it's, Lawyer, Trey Kaufman-Renn, obviously Braden Smith. They've been in so many battles. It's almost like they're pacing themselves. And while their defense hasn't been I think their defense has struggled more than Matt Painter has thought they would this year. They haven't been as connected, and they've been inconsistent. Especially Lawyer shooting the ball has been inconsistent. They know what they have, and they know that even though they're not playing great, the floor is probably still a 3 seed with this upcoming schedule. They'll probably end up as the 8th overall, so on the back end of the 2 line, and they didn't even play great all year. That's kind of an amazing feat for Matt Painter's program. That they've got to continue to guard. I think when they've gone on the road and when they've struggled is when they've just gone away. They've had 10 and 12 minute stretches in games where they haven't guarded. They really struggled in the back half of that Indiana game with Indiana's perimeter guards and Wilkerson. They don't generate the dangerous thing about Purdue is if they get in transition, Smith is deadly, but they're not generating the turnovers this year as they did. And they're not able to cash in and get in transition to get Smith's, assist totals to the 14-16 range. They're kind of settling in that 6 to 8 to 10 range. And they're not getting as many easy shots. Trey Kaufman-Renn isn't having nearly the season he had. Purdue's probably going to be a 2 seed. With all that said, they're probably a 2 seed. Still a fantastic season, slightly disappointing. But ultimately, all of those guys know they're going to be graded on March Madness. So I think they've kind of guided the ship. They're saving some energy and give it a go in March.
Yeah, that's always been my thought process with this team. They were widely picked to win the Big Ten at the beginning of the season. Everybody thought that's what they were going to do, but at the end of the day, this senior class, Trey Coffin, Rand Fletcher, Lawyer, Braden Smith, all these guys, they're going to be judged by what they do here in March, and it's the most important time for them. You made the Chiefs comparison, Jason. I got to know who on this team is dating Taylor Swift. I mean, if this is the Chiefs.
Oh boy.
I put you on the spot with that one.
I'll go Braden Smith because he's the first team All-American and preseason player of the year. We'll go with that guy.
There you go.
Not quite the same body type as
Travis
as
Kelce,
most of but we'll go with that.
All right, there we go. I like it. All right, let's move on here to the Nebraska Cornhuskers. Boy, undefeated team for most of the season, and then here lately they've kind of traded back and forth. They lost to Michigan at Michigan, Illinois. They come back, they beat Rutgers, lose to Purdue, beat Northwestern, and then Iowa gets them in that defensive battle. Both teams scoring under 60 points in that one. Iowa really needed that one after losing to Maryland, losing to Purdue. We'll talk about them a little bit here later on, but a lot of people were looking at this Nebraska team as a 1 seed at one point with how dominant they were. Ever since Rank Mass got hurt and you had some other issues out there, this team, again, not playing poorly, but maybe not where they were before. Feels like some teams in the league are kind of figuring them out a little bit more. Yeah. If I had to ask you to predict the seed, over, under 3.5, where are you going seed-wise for this Nebraska team?
Oh, man. I'm going to go with the over. I think they end up in that 4 seed range. And listen, it's an incredible story with Fred Hoiberg and the job he's done there. And obviously what an incredible feat to have your son be one of the senior leaders. And that's an incredible story. I think, they're going to lead and they're going to win a tournament game. So the first tournament win in program history will be, with his son. What really hurts them in terms of seeding is an underlying number that's really, really critical to the committee, and that's the non-conference strength of schedule. So the committee has been steadfast on this over the years, and it doesn't get talked about enough on major publications, but the reality is there's 365 teams in Division I basketball, and if your non-conference strength of schedule is higher than about 250, the committee starts to say, during November and December, you chose not to play anybody. Because you chose not to play anybody, we're going to penalize you. And often it's a seed line. So if you're going to give me 3 or 4, I'm going to go with the 4 because their non-conference strength of schedule was 303, 303rd in the country. And that is a very high number for a high major team. You don't see in the 300s very often. When you do, they usually pay for it with a seed line. Their metrics are really good. Everybody thinks of Nebraska as this kind of high-powered offense in shooting threes. And while they can absolutely shoot the ball from the perimeter quite well, they're actually the 5th ranked defense in the country. They guard. I mean, they really guard. And that was the case with the rock fight they got in a slow-paced game, which Iowa was very comfortable playing a slow-paced game at Iowa. They do have the road win at Illinois. They've got the home win against Michigan State. And really for the Big Ten schedule, a pretty easy closing stretch. So there's absolutely a possibility to hang on the 3, but if they go out west and they lose one of the games to USC, I just think their body of work is tremendous, but their non-conference work wasn't enough that they're not going to get the benefit out. If a team like Gonzaga wins the West Coast Conference tournament, they're going to jump Nebraska, right? Nebraska would really have to do some damage in the Big Ten tournament. So they'll be right on the edge. It was a fantastic question. I think they slide to the 4 when it's all said and done.
When you say do some damage in the Big Ten tournament, or where you thinking championship game, Final Four in the tournament? What kind of goes through your mind there?
Yeah, I think they need to beat a team kind of in a high stature. So they probably got to get to the finals. The reality is we all know the Big Ten final is like the committee can say all they want about that it's factored in and contingency plans. And while I believe they build multiple brackets, those games are not weighted. They don't have the weight that you would assume they would have with regard to the committee. Those seeds are sown prior to those games being played on Sunday of selection Sunday. So I think they'd have to make the finals, but even said with that, those games just don't carry the weight. You know, conference tournament games do not carry the weight that fans think they do. The number of years, JR, if you would see the bracket that you build, for us bracketologists, the bracket that we build heading into that final weekend, if you just took a snapshot on Friday, it's traditionally more accurate than what it evolves to on Sunday. If you just kind of stop it on Friday, that's about what the committee goes with. And so, it'll be interesting to see if they evolve, but that non-conference strength of schedule is really going to hurt them. They don't have any wins of note in the non-conference.
I remember us talking about that last year, and I reflected back on that conversation when we talked about Ohio State and how, them even losing in the Big Ten tournament where they were still going to be a team that would probably be close to getting into the tournament. And I believe they were one of the first four out. I think it was them and West Virginia were the first two that the committee had out. So even with the poor end of the season and the poor showing there in the Big Ten tournament against an Iowa team that later on fires Fran McCaffrey, you're still seeing a situation here where, like you said, the thought process going into the tournament was just about the same, with what actually came out on Sunday with the committee.
That's right. That's exactly right.
So, all right, well, let's move on here to the Michigan State Spartans. And the Spartans, 6-4 in quad 1 games, 5-1 in quad 2 games. They are 21-5 overall, number 12 in net. The unfortunate thing for the Spartans is they do have a pretty difficult schedule here to end the season. They have Ohio State. Now they get them at home, but Ohio State just had a really good showing against Wisconsin. Can they bounce back? Not bounce back. Can they continue to play off of that performance and look really good against Michigan State? Then you have to go at Purdue, at Indiana, Rutgers, a nice little break there in the middle, but we saw what Michigan State and Rutgers was early on in the season. They almost lost that one there, and so then you at the end you get to at and Michigan. This is a really tough schedule for Michigan State here to end the season. Would a losing record for Michigan State in their final 5 games drop them from the 4 seed line to outside of that to maybe a 5 seed or something like that? Or what are your thoughts on Michigan State and their possible seeding with this really tough schedule to end the season?
Yeah, I think listen, so much of the conversation that takes place late, everybody comes like a prisoner of the moment late in the season. But the reality is these last couple of games, there's been 30 or so games played before it. I think Michigan State's going to be a 4 seed just about any way you kind of wiggle it, unless again, like we talked about with Michigan, unless there's a doomsday scenario, because those losses just won't hurt you. Like the committee's not going to penalize you for those kind of big time losses. And if they're able to steal one of those, they'll even rise a little bit. Their wins above the bubble, and we might as well touch on that starting now. That is one of the largest, most important metrics that any kind of detailed college basketball fan can look at. And so the committee in the NCAA tournament releases a statistic, and it's called WAB or WAB. It's wins above the bubble. And so what it means, if we kind of break it down simply, is the number of wins your team has acquired throughout the season that is above what an average bubble team is. So it starts at kind of 0. So their wins above bubble is 12, right? So that's kind of on the 3 line, right? And so that gives them the wiggle room. Of the top 20 teams last year, all of them, they basically, the NCAA tournament, the top 20 seeds were the top 20 teams in the WAB. They went boom, 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 boom. And so because of that, they have some wiggle room to drop down even a few spots and still be okay. They've struggled at times shooting from the perimeter, right? That's been their MO over the last handful of years. They play really hard, really skilled defensively. Fears has been fantastic. I think they settle in even with the hard schedule at the 4 line.
Yeah, I think they've done enough in this as well. Beating Illinois there, I think was a huge win for them. And early on in the season, like you talked about before, difficult schedule in the out of conference, and the committee is always going to respect stuff like that. So
that's
I
exactly
have
right.
this. Yeah, I have the same expectation of a 4 seed and everything else as well. All right, let's move on here to a little bit closer to the bubble. This team's not quite on the bubble, but Wisconsin has some of the best wins in the country
Yeah,
against
absolutely.
Michigan and Illinois, but they've also dropped some games in this one. Now they're quad 1 and quad 2 games, so it's not exactly anything unrespectable or anything disrespectful or anything like that. But you do get blown out by Ohio State on Ohio State's floor. Ohio State doesn't have the best home court advantage in the
Mhm.
world, but still, Ohio State, probably gets more credit for that win than I would think Wisconsin loses credit for that. I think you had them as an 8 seed in your most recent bracketology you put out there. What does Wisconsin need to do here at the end of the season, going against Iowa, at Oregon, at Washington, Maryland, and at Purdue, to try and stay above that 8 seed, try to get a 7 or a 6 seed or something like that?
Yeah, as crazy as it sounds, they've just got to kind of take care of business on that West Coast trip. Those Oregon Washington games, they seem easy. Oregon's really struggled this year, but Washington's not an easy place to play. Teams have gone out there. Ohio State really struggled out there when they went there. I think they've got to kind of steal those, and win the home game against Iowa and Maryland, and then if you can't get the road game against Purdue, that's no problem. So that again, that West Coast trip, kind of holding serve against those kind of downtrodden West Coast teams would seal the deal for wearing a light colored jersey in the tournament. Like you said, JR, they won at Michigan and at Illinois, and that's just crazy good numbers. No really bad losses to speak of at all. What's incredible about Wisconsin is they never turn the ball over, but then they don't get turnovers as well. I mean, they play at a fast pace. So what's interesting is Boyd and Blackwell have been so fantastic. Their backcourt is fantastic that I encourage everybody to kind of watch Wisconsin play, because now as fans kind of gear up for March Madness and you think it's the same Wisconsin, slow and plodding, and no, they take a ton of threes, but they're in transition. They really get up and go. They play at a faster pace than really they've ever played under good Garb. So really entertaining team. Their backcourt is very dangerous. I think they can, even if they slot in as a 6 or 7 seed in the tournament, I think they can do damage because experienced guards play in March. Like that, really, that's the formula of success. So I think Wisconsin's in a really good spot, and they've proven they can beat anybody in the country.
Yeah, this is one of the best guard duos in the Big Ten, and probably when you get out into the country, it can be talked about as one of the best guard duos in the country between Nick Boyd and John Blackwell. I think as long as they get some good matchups for them that aren't too weighted in the direction of the other team or anything like that, I think this is a Wisconsin team we're most likely going to see in the Sweet 16. Maybe
Yeah,
not most likely, but have a good chance of getting to the
absolutely.
Sweet 16. Of course, it comes down to matchups and things like that in March.
Absolutely.
So we'll see how it goes there. All right, let's move on to Iowa here. Mentioned them a little bit earlier. The Iowa Hawkeyes, like I said, they lost that Maryland game. Now, it was at Maryland, but still, Maryland is not a good basketball team this season. That's not
Yeah.
something you want on your resume. That's a quad 3 loss. Then they followed up with a loss to Purdue on their home court, but then they get the win against Nebraska. So, Ben McCollum has his team looking a little bit better right now, saved themselves a little bit. I don't think they were ever really in concern of missing the tournament, but I do think that with that Maryland loss and kind of getting blown out by Purdue, there's maybe some concern of losing some seeding, especially if you don't play well at the end of the season. Are you with me, Jason? Do you feel like the Nebraska win kind of alleviated some of the concern, or do you look at the schedule at the end of the season and say, yeah, at Wisconsin, Ohio State, at Penn State, Michigan, and at Nebraska? Obviously, Penn State, not the worst thing in the world, but still at Penn State. Are you with me and say this is a pretty difficult schedule and you can't go on cruise control just at Iowa?
I think JR, the Nebraska win was immensely important for them. They were starting to push towards that 9 line and starting to get a little bit nervous that they just didn't have the depth of quality of wins, especially that quad 3 loss at Maryland was a really, really shaky loss. They had really only 2 wins over teams in the bracket. They had won at Indiana, and then technically USC at home, because UCLA is probably not in the bracket if it ended today. So they didn't have a lot of depth. They absolutely had to have it. And like you said, they didn't play well at all against Purdue. And it was just a huge, huge win. I think that win will get them in the bracket. And it probably, their resume is probably going to be enough to avoid Dayton. But, if they stumble down the stretch, they could be one of those teams like, oh man, they got a 10 seed. I thought they were a little better than that. So I don't think that they're safe from kind of being, a top 8 seed in the tournament, but they're going to make the bracket. That was an immensely important win for them. It's tricky with Iowa. They have such a small margin of error when they play. I watched, Ben McCollum coached at Drake last year, and so I went and watched them in the Missouri Valley tournament, and the pace at which they played was somewhere past deliberate. They were 364th in the country out of 365 teams when he was at Drake. Well, he's brought that over. They're 350 this year. A Big Ten team at 350 is one thing, but Iowa, who's been up and down the court right under Fran over the years, they play so slow. They're so methodical, and so they're not going to blow teams out in the NCAA tournament. That's going to be a margin of error, reduced possessions, which means they could beat anybody or get beat by anybody.
Yeah, it's such a stark difference from what we've seen under Iowa from the past. And I think at the end of the day, maybe it's not as exciting as what we've seen, but ultimately it's better basketball. And at the end of the day, if you're an Iowa fan, that's just what you wanted to see, because this gives you an even better shot in the NCAA tournament and making the NCAA tournament,
that's right.
Quite frankly, as well. So, all right, let's move on here to Ohio State. And Jason, I'm going to make this question real simple for you. I've kind of asked you some little bit of different questions here and there, but the Buckeyes find themselves on the bubble once again. Yeah. This is the third straight year. Jake Diebler, took over for Chris Holtmann, got the team a little bit closer, but not quite there. Last year, they're one of the first four out there with West Virginia. They were kind of the first two teams that didn't get into the tournament this season. They're 0-8 in quad one games. That Wisconsin win helps, but it was on their own floor. It was still only a quad two win for them. Northwestern is kind of that team that's on the verge of being in the top 75 to get them a quad one win, but it goes away from that. Just, quite frankly, how many games does Ohio State need to win to finish the season to just get into the tournament here, Jason?
Yeah, we have this conversation every year, JR, at this time, right? Every year, it's our annual pilgrimage to this conversation. So I will say this, as someone that follows Ohio State basketball very, very closely, we could spend the next hour on it, but I'll try to pare it down. To answer your question, though, succinct way, they got to go 3-2. They got to go 3-2. So when you talk about, how do they get there? At Michigan State, at Iowa, and home against Purdue, you got to win one. I don't care which one it is, you got to win a game somehow. Can you have a crowd? I think the Purdue game is I think it's a Sunday CBS game. Can you get a home crowd to generate the excitement and take care of business there? Maybe that's the one you're going to get. Maybe you can get in a rock fight and beat Iowa. Michigan State's going to be really tough. So you're going to have to win one of those three, then hold serve at Penn State, and then take care of business against a pretty good Indiana team at home. 3-2, I think, gets them in the tournament. Could be Dayton, depending on if any bids are stolen by some of the non-power conferences, but they're going to get them in. I'll say this. If you're an Ohio State fan and you want a nugget that gives you maybe allows you to sleep a little better tonight, let's go. All you got to go back to is last year. We don't got to go too far back. We're talking about a North Carolina team last year that was 1-12 in quadrant one games. Okay. So let's stay there. They were 1-12 in quad one, and they made the NCAA tournament. They were 8-0 in quad two. Their net was a 36 and their wins above bubble was 42. Okay. All right, so let's go to Ohio State. They're 0-8 now, but if they get one of those quad one wins, they'll end up with a very similar number, and they'll be right around probably 8-1 or so in quadrant two, very close to Carolina. No true bad losses other than the banked in 3 against Pitt. And their wins above bubble and their metrics will be almost identical to Carolina. So there is a roadmap, there is a path. I think sometimes people focus too much now on the quadrant one, quadrant two system. I think that was always meant for the NCAA tournament selection committee to be a organizational tool. Truly, I think now because I think what the committee focuses more on than even just the quadrant based wins is who did you beat, where did you beat them, and I know that's baked into the net. But one of the tools I try to have on my website is talking about how many wins against tournament teams do you have? I think that truly matters to the committee, and less about, well, is Northwestern today on Tuesday the 75th best versus 78th best, and the quadrant going back and forth. 3-2, I think, gets them in, but it's going to be a challenge, right? They're going to have to really play better. It's hard without Mobley. The wild card is Devin Royal. when he has played exceptionally well, and he did against UCLA and he did against Wisconsin, when he plays well, they are a wagon. They're a very good basketball team because Bruce Thornton is one of the best players in college basketball. He truly is, when you watch him game in and game out, but he needs help. When Royal plays well and he's focused and he's motivated, they're absolutely an NCAA tournament basketball team. When he doesn't bring the level of intensity, and you saw that against Virginia, they just don't have the complementary pieces then to win big games. He didn't have it against Carolina. He didn't have it against Virginia, and they were so close to those wins. If a couple of these games flip over the last really 3 or 4 years for Ohio State, they could have made the tournament every year. They're very close. I think they're one of the best 40 or so at-large teams in the country. I think they end up getting in, but it's going to be close.
Yeah, I remember when that bank shot happened there against Pitt early on in the season, and I just thought to myself, if this is the game that
It might be.
keeps them out, how terrible that's going to be. I mean,
it was last year, right? It was
was.
last year.
It was.
The day after Thanksgiving, they lost to Pitt, and that probably kept them out of the tournament last year. It very might this year. Listen, they had a 4-point lead against Carolina with 9 seconds to go and got beat in regulation, right? So they had a 6-point lead against Virginia with 4 minutes to go the other, last Saturday. So they've shown that they can play really good basketball for 36, 38-minute stretches. Can they close games? They got to win one of the next 3. That's the math. So if you're an Ohio State fan and they go on Sunday and they don't play well at Michigan State, they get beat by 20, throw it away. It doesn't matter. Close wins are not going to, they don't need a close loss. They've just got to find a way to win. 2 blowouts and 1 win, that's just fine.
Yeah, and that's kind of what you've gotten from this Ohio State team. Close loss against Nebraska. You had a close loss there against Virginia. Close loss against North Carolina, Illinois. They were in that game there for a while. So it's been the story of close losses this season for Ohio State. But hopefully we'll see if they can capitalize here at the end of the season like they did against Wisconsin. That really wasn't a close game. But like Jake Diebler said after that game, Wisconsin is just a team that can get going like crazy. So it didn't matter how much you were up by, you wanted to try and keep them at length as long as you possibly could. So, all right, Jason, good stuff there on Ohio State. Let's go ahead and move on over to the Indiana Hoosiers. The Hoosiers, bit of a bubble team. They're kind of there as well. I know some people probably see them as having much more of a better opportunity to get into the tournament than a team like Ohio State, but I would still probably categorize them as bubble-ish, if not totally on the bubble. How safe do you feel like Indiana is to making the tournament?
Yeah, I mean, most of the statistical metrics, you look at Bart Torvik and some of that, they got him at about 90%. So, I mean, that makes you feel really good if you're an Indiana fan. The reality is all of their wins of note happened within the same week, a couple weeks ago. They won at home at Purdue and then won a really close game at UCLA. But the reality is UCLA may not even make the tournament. They very well might, and then they may not. And so they can't hang their hat on that. Again, going back to Ohio State, they're criticized for being 0-8 in quad 1. Totally get it. That's completely legitimate. But if you bundle quad 1 and quad 2 together, they're 6-9. If you bundle Indiana together, like kind of top half wins, right? They're 4-9. They don't have the depth of wins that a lot of people assume that they would have. They just simply don't. They, home win against Wisconsin, which was very fortunate, right? And a really close win against Purdue and UCLA. They're a couple plays away from being on the outskirts of the bubble. They've won some close games. Obviously, very good coaching and good guard play late. I think they make the tournament. I think they're pretty safe, but obviously a trip to Purdue, trip to Ohio State won't be easy. But they get the 3-game home stretch where they have in the middle here Northwestern, Michigan State, and Minnesota. I think the reality is if you're an Indiana fan, if you just take care of business with winning Northwestern and Minnesota at home, that's probably enough, probably even enough to stay out of Dayton. If you somehow slip up in 1 or 2 of those games and you lose at Purdue and at Ohio State, then you're going to start sweating. But if they just take care of the games they should win at home, they'll be okay.
Could you see a possibility to where we have another season with Ohio State and Indiana close at the end of the season playing against each other, and it almost feels like they're almost kind of playing each other? I think this happened either last year or 2 years ago, where it feels like whoever wins this game gets into the tournament.
Yeah, I mean, you could, right? They're going to play the last game of the regular season, right, at Ohio State. And there's absolutely mathematical possibility that they come back and they need to play in the 8-9 game or the 7-10 game in the Big Ten tournament. And so absolutely, I think that's the case. Some of the success of Indiana is going to be tied to their UCLA win. And so how does UCLA finish? Because that may not be a win versus an at-large team. And then they're down to only 2 wins versus the at-large team. So it's a really good question. I think it's possible. I think, in looking at it, I think they've got a very high probability to make the tournament. Could they slip out? Yes, but I think they're in pretty good shape. Although their non-conference strength of schedule is 212. Again, you get in the 200s, start playing with a little bit of fire, because there's no reason a major conference team has a non-conference strength of schedule in the 200s. There's just no reason. You should be able to play, 100, 120 type non-conference, play a few major teams, and have some wins. They have nothing of note in the non-conference, nothing. And the committee has looked unfavorably upon that in the past.
And similar to Ohio State with that Pitt loss early on in the season, Indiana has that Minnesota loss there. Wasn't quite the game there at the end, 73-64. Minnesota won that game, but still quad 2 loss that is kind of on the lower end a little bit and something you really don't want to have on your resume. So we'll see if Indiana can come back from that one. All right, we've mentioned UCLA here a number of times, so let's go ahead and talk about them, Jason. UCLA just did a video on Mick Cronin yesterday and this whole odd situation with him throwing out Jamerson in the game, and then the way he's treating reporters. Not always, he's not always been the most pleasant guy to the reporters, but that one was a little bit over and beyond from what we've seen for UCLA, and it looks like this could be a team that plays their way out of the tournament, especially here to end the season. They have Illinois, USC, at Minnesota, Nebraska, at USC. That is not an easy end of the season there. You don't have the big names of Michigan and Purdue on there, but you do have Illinois, you do have Nebraska, USC, the rivalry, and at Minnesota. That's been a dangerous team that people have seen this season. How concerned are you for UCLA with their current drama and difficult schedule to end the season?
Very concerned. I think UCLA's profile is the most kind of bloated profile in the country. I've been, on some additional podcasts and some conversations I've had. I think that a UCLA team is very skilled. I mean, they're very skilled, very good. Donovan Dent was the best player in the Mountain West and a very good Mountain West last year, right, in New Mexico. And he just hasn't really matched. Now, we say all that, listen, UCLA gets a date and they go Sweet 16. They've got plenty of skilled players. They haven't meshed, and you can tell the frustration with Mick Cronin day after day after day after day. Hopefully he's cool with us talking about his team, and you don't get a letter from him. So
just not ask him any bad questions, okay?
Yeah, no bad questions. This just goes to show you, the quad-based system is a bit kind of light in a sense of they have one win. They have one win. It was like a 1-point win against Purdue. They have one win over a team that's going to make the tournament, home at Purdue. That's it. Their next best win is a win at Washington. Okay, sure. And that's a quad 1 win. Yeah, but that's not a tournament win. And then there's no tournament wins in the quad 2. Home against Washington, Arizona State, Oregon, Penn State. There's nothing there. So they have one win. Well, heck, West Virginia has 3 tournament wins, right? And they're not even on the periphery of the bubble. And so I don't think that there's enough depth. The road and the neutral record is 3-8. That's very poor, right? They've struggled on the road, and they're not defending at a level of which Mick Cronin teams. They're 260th in the country in 2-point field goal percentage defense. They're just not guarding like Mick Cronin teams do. You can tell the frustration. They've lost 3 of 5. Of all the games this weekend, and I know everybody talk about Michigan and Duke, and they should. Maybe one of the most important games in the entire weekend is Illinois UCLA. I mean, that's just such a critical game. We saw what Iowa's resume, how well it improved by just beating Nebraska at home. And so can they beat Illinois at home? I'll say this: the difference between the back end of the 9 line, the 9 seed line, and like the first 4 out is like 1 win against a tournament team. It's so jumbled. It's so close. Most of these teams at this stage have 3 wins. Bubble teams have 2 to 3 wins over tournament teams. Now, some of the smaller schools don't, but major conference do. They have one. Again, only the win at home versus Purdue. Right now, I don't have them in the NCAA tournament. It all changes if they get Illinois. And we'll talk about USC in a minute. There's 5 games left in the regular season, and they play each other twice. So if someone sweeps it, they probably make the tournament. If someone gets swept, they're not making the tournament. If they split, one's probably getting in and one's probably being left out.
Yeah, and that's kind of what the FanDuel odds indicate as well. UCLA currently is minus 170 on FanDuel. USC is plus 150
Yeah,
on FanDuel, which is interesting because just last night USC had better odds to
that's
make,
right.
to win the national championship than UCLA did. But of course, USC has some really good talent on their team. They're just hurt right now with Chad Baker-Mazzaro, Rodney Rice out for the year and stuff like that. So it really does show you with the FanDuel odds just how close things are right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as we transition and talk about USC, they're right now they're quote unquote safer in most kind of publications and kind of in bracketology, but their resume is also quite thin, right? They're 1-6. They did win at Wisconsin. They played a really good Sunday game and beat Wisconsin. They do have a home win against Indiana. Other than that, that's it. That's it, right? And so that's 2 tournament wins, which is obviously better than UCLA's. That's why I think they're in. They did a good job in the road. They played really well in Maui, but it wasn't a strong Maui field this year. Especially with the Players Era tournament taking away a lot of teams. But they're 9-4 and neutral in road games. That's pretty good. Um, when they've had a full roster, they've been pretty good. When does Mazzaro come back? Who knows? Probably pretty soon. As of now, they're slotted ahead of UCLA, but again, they play each other 2 out of 5. So whoever wins those games is going to prevail. They get Oregon at home to get healthy. Then they go at UCLA, Nebraska at home, at Washington, UCLA. It's not Murderers Row, and most of it's on the West Coast. So we'll have to see. I think there's when you're that close and you play each other 2 out of 5, it's hard for both of them to make the tournament. And then, so if you're an Ohio State fan, that's why that spot then goes to an Ohio State if they win 3 out of 5, right? So a lot of times it's bid thieves in other conferences, but a lot of times it's kind of which teams, Indiana, Ohio State have played it out over the years. Which teams take the bids? Oh, the Big Ten's getting 10 bids. Make no mistake. Can they get 11? Maybe, but they're getting 10 bids. So who's taking the 10?
The most bids of any conference, correct?
Yes, I think they will. There's the Big 12 is a wonderful conference this year, but they're just not going to have the depth of teams. The back end of the Big 12 is not going to have it. The Big 12 will probably settle in that 7 range, maybe 8 if everything works out. But the Big 10 will exceed all the other conferences with 10 or 11.
Yeah, the SEC probably getting 8 or 9, I think.
Yeah,
Last
they
time I
got a
saw.
bunch of bubble teams in the SEC, right? They don't have the kind of the top tier teams they had last year. I think they had 14 bids last year. It was an incredible performance by the league. ACC is a little better, right? They're going to probably head towards 6, which is a good number for the ACC. Big East is down; they'll probably have just 3. So there's bids to be had in the Big Ten. Big Ten commissioners probably hoping that UCLA and USC split. Maybe they both get in. So we'll have to see. I encourage the fans as you look into it, don't place too much emphasis on the Big Ten tournament. I know as a fan, these games really, really matter. Maybe the first round matters. Maybe a play-in game where an Ohio State USC game might matter and kind of one clearly advances, but it's one win or loss in about 32, and so you have to make sure you remember it as that, because that's how the committee sees it.
Yeah, I think the last time it came down to really a game in the Big Ten tournament, and it was just speculation, but I think it was 2 years ago, Ohio State, Illinois in that game where it looked
Yeah.
like Ohio State, maybe if they got that win against Illinois, that was such a hard fought game, such a fun game to watch. I remember that one. Didn't end my way, I'm a Buckeye, so didn't end my way, but I like the Final Illini too, and they had a good season that year as well. So, all right, Jason, any other teams or anything that needs to be mentioned? I mean, obviously, it would be some huge dark horses. Washington right now is even with their schedule. So, I've seen some people mention that they have a 5, maybe 2% chance or something like that to get in there if they win the rest of their games. Is there anybody else out there in the Big Ten as we wrap it up here?
No, Washington's just struggled too much late. You know, there was a lot of momentum building because the last 8 games were they had the weakest draw. You know,
Mhm.
and so they say, well, they're just going to rip through it. The reality is, they lost at home to Penn State, and that does it. Right? You can't absorb that when you're too close, and then just the amount of losses. Now that they're approaching 15 losses, and that's the magic number. When you see a team have 14 losses in the regular season and acquire then a fifth one in their conference tournament, they don't make it. Auburn is going to be pushing that. That's going to be a fun one to watch in the SEC. But no, I don't think there's any Cinderellas. I will say this, if you're an Oregon fan, I am completely amazed at Oregon season. With I, they had the parts and pieces back. They had Dana Altman. I spoke with him a little bit at the Big Ten, preseason media day. I think he was really confident he's got a pretty good roster. I think if you would have kind of given him a lie detector test, I think he thought they'd probably be in the top, in that 6 to 8 range of the Big Ten. And he had a lot of experienced players coming back, Shielstead, and they just didn't perform. I think, one of the challenges at Oregon right now and the challenge at Ohio State, a lot of these teams is they're not having the home court advantage that they used to have. And so they're really struggling in drawing and struggling with home games. But um, there's something to me about maybe some sort of crazy Oregon run. Maybe they rip through because they have the parts and pieces. They just haven't given the effort that you would think. Washington's a dark horse, but the cut line is going to be, in that Ohio State, UCLA, USC range. Can they all get in or not? There's not going to be anybody charging that's gonna jump into the conversation of the bubble. It's pretty much set.
Very interesting stuff, Jason. You are one of the best out there at doing it, man. We really appreciate you coming on here. Everybody go check him out. Big Underdog there, big underdog.com, and check out his social media over there on Twitter/X and everything else that Jason does. He does wonderful work. And Jason, we're not too close to the end of the season. We'll have to do this again sometime, right?
Yeah, have me. I'll come back anytime. Just let me know. So
There you go. There you go. So look for that coming up soon. We'll have Jason on again next week, maybe in a couple weeks or something like that to do something. So, but I do want to remind everybody, do tune in Friday night after the Indiana Purdue game. I'm going to be live here on this channel talking about that one, maybe a couple other topics. We'll see what the news cycle does. And then Saturday, big day Saturday, as you heard Jason talk about, that UCLA Illinois game is going to be huge. We're going to go live right after that game as well, talk about it. Could be a really, really fun time for the UCLA fans, or
yeah.
could be not the most fun time for the UCLA fans out there. We'll see how it turns out, and we'll go live here on this channel Friday night after the Indiana Purdue game, Saturday night following the UCLA and Illinois game as well. So thanks so much for watching, everybody. Like, subscribe if you're here on YouTube, if you're on podcast, 5-star rating and review always helps us out as well. I don't ask for those things enough. So for those of you guys that do it, even though I don't ask enough, I really appreciate it. So thank you to Jason. Thanks everybody for listening and watching. Have a good one. We'll see you next time.
Thanks so much.